You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 168. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Barbera, and I'm thrilled to welcome on the show a married couple. I think this might be our first, well, my husband and I were a married couple on the show together, but I am interviewing Dr. William Heward and Dr. Jill Dardig. And many of you who are BCBAs, who are in the ABA field, will recognize Dr. Bill Heward's name because he is the co-author of the famous white book, Applied Behavior Analysis, now in its third edition. And he also is the author of Exceptional Children, An Introduction to Special Education, which is in its 12th edition. And between Applied Behavior Analysis and his second book, combined sales for those two titles total more than 1 million copies, which is amazing. And they're translated into so many languages, which is amazing. Now, his wife is very accomplished as well. Dr. Jill Dardig is the professor emerita of education at Ohio Dominican University, where she trained special education teachers for over 30 years. They are on the show today, Jill and Bill, and we agreed to call them by their first names to make things easier. They are here to discuss their new book called Let's Make a Contract, which I had the pleasure of reviewing and writing a blurb for this. And it really is a very good ABA tool that is underutilized. And we talk all about what a behavior contract is, who it's for, what age, how long should a behavior contract be written for, and how to avoid nagging and falling back into the slippery slope of if, then, first work, then get, reinforcement, and all the things that could go wrong within behavior contracts we talk about too. So it was a delight to catch up with Bill and Jill. So let's get to this great episode with Dr. William Heward and Dr. Jill Dardig. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jill and Bill. I feel kind of weird using your first names, but just for simplicity, we agreed to do that. So thank you so much for joining us today to share your knowledge with our listeners.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into what the topic is and why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? We'll go with you, Jill.
Well, I know you've asked other presenters how they fell into autism. I think that was your phraseology. And mine came when I was in graduate school in the early 1970s. Actually, we were both at UMass Amherst. And we were working for a project that provided services to children who were deaf and hearing impaired.
Okay.
And the first summer I was there, we did an in-service project down at the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. It was a summer program for the kids in their regular school program who needed additional help during the summer. And all the kids were, most of them were moderately to profoundly deaf, and many of them had other additional diagnoses. And my job was to work with one-on-one with a couple of the kids that had the most severe difficulties. And so my first child that I worked with was, I'm going to call her Kelly for this podcast. She was 7.5 years old, and she was profoundly deaf and also had been diagnosed with autism. So she did all the stereotypic behaviors, the rocking, flapping, tooth grinding, and so forth. And at that time, I was a little bit at a loss. I was starting out in the field, and I started doing a little research to see what could I do with this little girl. She had no eye contact whatsoever when I first started working with her. And as I think Mark Sundberg pointed out in his podcast, there really wasn't a lot available to read at that time. I mean, this was 50 years ago.
Wow.
There was a lot of discussion about the causes of autism. And some of the listeners might remember Dr. Bruno Bettelheim, who was a recognized physician. And his thesis was that blame it on the mom. The mom is what he called a refrigerator mother and rejected the child, was cold and icy toward the child, and the child just turned inward. So that was sort of part of the prevailing thought. But I did come upon some of the studies that were done by Risley, Wolf, Lovas, and modeled some of my techniques along those lines. I also involved the parents and the other teaching staff at the school. And so, to make a long story short, after working with her for 3 or 4 weeks, I had been able to establish really strong eye contact using some prompts that I faded, some edibles that I also was able to fade. And this skill for this little Kelly was kind of the gateway to her learning sign language, to her social skills, to being able to communicate. And the parents were great. I worked with them in the home. They were able to generalize some of her new skills to the home. But I only worked with her for the summer. And I was able to make a visit in the fall and do a follow-up. And she was doing quite well. She still had many autistic-like behaviors, and she needed a lot of work in communication. But her parents said she was a completely different child, much more sociable, making choices actively, communicating at a very low level, but still making a breakthrough there. This whole experience to me was so informative because, first of all, it introduced me to autism. And I found out that people with autism are very interesting people. And the second was using ABA techniques could really teach students with autism, and we could see some pretty dramatic results. And the third was the importance of involving parents, because the parents had told me that previously they'd taken her to psychiatrists and other treatment options. And not only didn't this little Kelly make any progress, the parents didn't know what was being done with her. They were totally excluded. They couldn't even watch what was going on.
Yeah.
So those things to me were very life-changing for me and got me really more involved in the special ed field, and particularly autism.
Wow.
I would say that the only, in retrospect, I mean, this is like an occupational hazard for anybody who teaches. This little girl would be 57 this year. I would love to know what she's doing, how she's doing, what her life has turned out to be.
Wow. So she
that
was diagnosed as deaf. And did she actually have the diagnosis of autism back then?
Yes, she did.
Yes, which was very early because
Yes,
autism
very
was
early.
only started to be diagnosed in the 1940s. So
Right.
yeah, so that's pretty incredible that she even had that diagnosis, especially being deaf, because I have worked with a few deaf students, and it's like, a lot of people, just like autism, they blame it on the autism. If they're deaf, they blame it on the deafness, and to get additional diagnoses, I'm sure at that time was extremely difficult. So that's really good. And I think I did a podcast. I know I did a podcast where I mentioned the refrigerator mother theory and the history of autism moms. So we can link that in the show notes. It's going to be podcast 168. So that's a wonderful story, Jill, and we're going to get more into your background and also your new book with Bill. So Bill, why don't you, our listeners in the ABA field, the behavior analysts listening, and definitely should know your name. So how did you fall into the autism world?
Well, I grew up wanting to be a baseball player, and still waiting for the Chicago Cubs to call, but I don't think they're going to. I went to college at Western Michigan University, started as a wet behind the ears freshman in 1967. Western was ranked number 4 Division I baseball at the time. I thought, well, I'm going to be there for a couple of years and then I'll be in Wrigley Field. And he said, well, you got to take some classes. Okay. So psychology, intro to psych, Psych 150 at the time, was taught by Dick Malott. I still have all 6 books that were assigned. We had a reading assignment, a quiz every day. Half of the semester was a rat lab, and you had to learn to apply these basic principles in that context. And several of the faculty had projects in the community where students could volunteer, do independent studies. And through there, I had my first experience getting to see the potential quality of life changing, effects of applying these principles, basic principles of behavior with children with disabilities. I ended up, won't bore you with that story, but somehow I ended up, very fortunately, as a graduate student at UMass Amherst at the same time.
I was, yes.
Jill Dardig was, and I had an opportunity to have an assistantship to support my time there in the same project with Jill.
Okay.
And during our second and third years there together, Jill and I had the opportunity to help found an early intervention program in Western Mass for children. Some were diagnosed with autism, others with severe behavior challenges and problems. Kids were roughly 3 to 8, 3 to 9. And this was, it's called Project Change. It began in 1973. Just from an historical basis, that's 2 years before President Ford in July of 75 signed, today it's called IDEA. It was the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which began, modern special education as we know it in the US, the requirement of an individual education plan and due process, and very importantly, parental involvement, parent and family involvement. In my role with the program, I had about a dozen kids, and I was head teacher. I think there were 3 of us as teachers. Tried to figure out together what to do. Half day, kind of a preschool early intervention program where we're doing our best to apply basic principles of behavior to change some targeted behaviors that would make a difference in those children's lives. Jill, her role was parent trainer. And Jill had a weekly session where with parents, where they met in the evening for a couple of hours, schooling them, introducing them to basic principles of behavior. She would do home visits where she'd demonstrate and work with the parents to role play things. And the parents had to each come at least once a week to observe what we were doing in the classroom. So we were all working together to do our best to have, as Jill had said, the importance of parents not just seeing what's being done with their child, but to see how they could potentially use those same teaching strategies to make a difference in the home. So if Jill could just tell you a little bit about her experience as a parent trainer, I think that'll lead nicely into the rest of our conversation with you.
I loved working with the parents. I had a really mixed group over the couple of years I was there. Some of the parents had a high school diploma. Some of them had graduate degrees. Some were blue collar, some were professionals. So it was a real mix of people. What they had in common was they all wanted to help their kids, desperately wanted to help them, because piggybacking onto what Bill just said, this was before IDEA, and their kids had been basically kicked out of other programs in schools. So they were like at their wits' end, we've got to do something now. So they were highly, highly motivated. And so the other thing is they all were open to trying new things. And when I went through all the ABA principles and strategies, it made a lot of sense to them. It didn't sound like gibberish. It sounded like practical advice. I think parents appreciate practical advice, like in your book, Turn Autism Around, which I have here.
Thank you.
Giving them specific instructions and strategies for bedtime, for example, for getting a haircut, for going to the dentist or the doctor. Parents appreciate that. They want something research-based, something that works, but they don't want to have to read all the original research. They want to know the application. And so the parents were very successful in doing programs, home programs with their own kids for various behaviors they were working on. And one strategy that they really all liked so much was behavioral contracting.
Okay.
They took to it immediately. It made sense. They were able to carry it out with their kids. And I got thinking, this is such a good strategy, not just for parents who have kids with disabilities, but really for parents of typical kids as well. How do we get this to a larger audience? I was working with maybe 6 to 8 parents at a time in groups. And that's just like a drop in the bucket. So I got thinking about a children's book, a book of stories that would be set in the context of a home and teach how to use contracting through that vehicle of this children's story. So the parents who read it wouldn't have to go to parent groups, their kids wouldn't have to be in a particular program. They could read the book and use the forms included in the book and then go from there. And so I collaborated with Bill. By this time we were dating. And
Only dating?
Well, yeah, dating.
How long are you guys? You guys aren't married?
Oh no, we're married. We've been married for like
45 and counting.
Okay, a long time. But
We're still back in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Okay.
A long time.
Oh, so you got the idea for writing a book on behavior contracts way back when you were just dating.
73.
Yes, right.
Wow.
So he was
Okay,
on board.
before we go on about behavior contracts, I just want to stop you for a second, just because a lot of our listeners, this is a new topic for them, and they might have a toddler just showing signs of autism. They might have a 15-year-old with severe autism, and from my experience, which is very little, we are going to talk about your book, which I have right here, Let's Make a Contract. And we are going to talk about behavior contracts, but I don't want to just slide into it because a lot of people might get confused. So I think what comes to mind when I think about this topic, and I'm definitely not an expert at this at all. In fact, I can't even think of one instance where I was with a client as a behavior analyst doing a contract, but I do think after reading your really great book and knowing a lot about ABA and a little bit about behavior contract, that I do think there needs to be some language, understanding, and cognitive ability of, say, a 4-year-old, maybe 3-year-old, typically developing child. So if you have and maybe you can maybe you want to disagree with that age, but we have to get children to a point where they understand, like, if this happens, then this happens, and to understand the language around contracts. But I do remember when I was thinking about this topic, I do remember my typically developing son when he was about 6, running into my room and saying, and I forget what he wanted. I want X. So I think he could barely write, and maybe he didn't even write anything. Maybe he just scribbled, and he presented me with this loose leaf sheet of paper.
Love it.
Like, sign here. I mean, literally he was like, I'm like, this kid's going to be a lawyer, which he's not, but at this point, but he was very adamant. Like, he got the idea, like, we should sign a contract. So basically a behavior contract is just like what Spencer did. He, but it would be developed by the adult here or in collaboration with the kid. Is that right?
In collaboration,
Right.
Sure.
In collaboration. So why don't we back up just quickly, and I know we definitely want to get back to the story of how this new book came, but what age is this for? What is a behavior contract? And because I do think that if I were going to do a behavior contract right now, I definitely would need this book to guide me, even as a seasoned behavior.
Sure. Well, behavior contract has 2 essential components: a task that is specified clearly what's entailed in doing the task, and then the reward that the child, or in the case of a child having a contract with his or her parent, and we talk about that too, the reward that comes afterwards. So a contract specifies, as you said, Mary, an if-then relationship. Contracts are a real behavior contract, as we're describing in our book, is a written agreement not necessarily in words, typically in words, but for very young children or children for whatever reason don't have reading skills or a lot of reading skills, there are picture contracts.
Okay.
And sometimes a contract, one of the examples is stories in our book. When we get to it, maybe can talk a little bit about this one as a contract to help a young boy with autism get ready for school in the morning. And he has some reading skills and there's some words on it. There's also a visual activity schedule built right into the contract where he can keep track of what. So, but I think Joe would agree. You described about roughly 4, maybe 3 for some kids would be at the youngest age, but there's no upper limit.
Right.
And importantly, both the research, most importantly, the research, and then very much both Jill's and my experience in working with families and teachers as well. Contracts can be used all the way up through, teenage, young adult years. Maybe grandparent has a contract for spending some quality time with the kids. All kinds of applications.
Okay. So let's get back to you, Jill, in terms of this book, Let's Make a Contract, which comes out officially in May, but there is a pre-order, and we can put that in the show notes, the link for the pre-order on Amazon. Just Google Let's Make a Contract. It's by both Jill Dardig and William Heward. And you can go ahead and pre-order it, but let's talk about what was the first book that you came up with and when did that happen?
Well, that happened in around, was it 74, 75? Bill has a copy right there. It was called Sign Here. You mentioned your son said, "Sign here, Mom." And so this was actually published by a company called Behavior Delia. Dick Malott and Don Whaley were the publishers. It was just a small publishing house that did ABA material. You might remember Con Man.
Captain Con Man.
It was a cartoon book that taught ABA principles. And so this is kind of right up their alley. And it got a wonderful illustrator for us. And
so it's the initial book called Sign Here, a contracting book for children and their parents, was published in 1976,
maybe
5. Yeah,
very
long time ago. And it tells the story of a family, 2 parents, 3 children. Both mom and dad works, very busy, typical family. 14-year-old Lynn, 10-year-old Jeff, and little 4-year-old toddler Pamela in that story. We did not identify Pamela as having a disability, although she'd be our child in her behavior. She hadn't learned how to play nicely with the pets. She'd pull the dog's ear and tail, and she'd drop her blocks in the fish tank and so forth. So she's a little girl that in our current story, we've clearly identified as a young girl with autism spectrum disorders. So the book was published in 76, a second edition, and came out in 81. Then the publisher that was doing the second edition, eventually went out of business. And around 92, Jill and I got a letter in the mail reverting all rights to the book back to us, and a couple boxes with the last 30 or 40 copies, that existed. And, we thought, well, we had a good run. That was neat. And figured that was the end of it. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I was at a conference in Romania, an ABA and autism conference. And the organizers and some of the parents I were talking with were saying how much they were looking for ways to just get information out and disseminate effective teaching practices, particularly to families. And I just remembered Sign Here, and I told them a little bit about the book, and I said, Jill and I will send you a copy, and if that might be of any interest to you. Within a year, this is Sign Here in Romanian, and they colorized the pictures. There's little Pamela dropping blocks in the fish bowl. So, wow, that's amazing. So the next year I'm at a conference in Moscow, ABA and autism. Here's Russian sign here.
But they didn't even ask your permission. They just did it.
No. Jill and I, in each case, we
Okay.
granted the rights to.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Because I know how that can go, and
It was all legit.
Italian, the Czech language,
yeah.
Turkish. Just in November, it's crazy. It's like Phoenix rising from the ashes. This is sign here in Chinese. It was published by a university press in China just in November. And in the spring, 2 more languages, Filipino and Japanese.
Yeah.
So about a year ago, Jill and I are saying, oh my goodness, English is going to be the only language.
Because it was out of print.
So
Yeah.
we thought, why don't we see if we could find a publisher to work with to bring back sign here and update it and bring. And we were very fortunate. The publisher found a developmental editor to work with us with great experience in children's books and all. She convinced us, don't just update it, deconstruct the thing, blow it up, let's put it back together and see. And so now we've got stories, not one family, we have 4 diverse families. 2 have children with autism spectrum disorders. And the first half of the book is, I think now you've seen, Mary, are these brief stories written at about the 4th grade reading level that a parent
When you
could
say
read.
4th grade reading level, just let me tell our listeners,
Sure.
That's not for 4th grade kids. This is when you write a book. When I wrote the verbal behavior approach or turn autism around, editors and the world say you should basically write at like a 5th grade level.
Yep.
You should not use big words. So like all the professionals out there that, know how I talk in very layman's terms, and, it's not, because, well, I'm not used to talking in highly technical terms. And when you were talking about like the 70s and the 80s and I didn't even know what ABA was until 1999 when my son was diagnosed with autism. And I really studied it in 2002. So I'm a relative newcomer to the ABA world. And because of my nursing background, I've always been much more like, okay, how can I translate this? How can I get this to the parent level and to disseminate it as far and wide? So not to cut you off, but like the 4th grade level, most people would think, well, is it a kid's book? No, it's a book for adults to read, but you definitely have to have a lot of collaboration when you do make a contract.
Yeah.
Right. And we've set the book up, as you've probably seen already. The first 9 chapters are the children's stories. So the parents can read with the child, or an older child who can read could read it by themselves. And the second half is kind of the how-to manual. Okay. So parents can start either way. They can read the children's stories, or they can go right to the how to make contracts and use them in your family. And in the stories, for the first several stories, we follow kind of a pattern. We present a problem in a family situation, and then the behavioral contract is introduced as a solution, but it doesn't go well the first time. There's a hitch. And so what the families do is they look at it again, they make some adaptations, modifications, and they try it again. And then it is successful. And so we're trying to communicate to parents that this isn't magic. It's not easy. There's work that has to go into this. And if things don't go well the first time, you make modifications and you try again.
And the flaws in these initial contracts are the exact same mistakes that we make in applying a reinforcement technique or a behavioral contract, not specifying the behavior well enough in the first one. So it goes awry. Jeff, the boy, thinks he cleaned his bedroom, but dad says, no, look, son, your desk is still a mess. And that hadn't been specified in the first contract.
So we use very common situations. We also, in the book, in the back of it, we have forms, contract forms that parents can use. But we also have a companion website so that a parent who's reading the book and wants to print out a couple of contract forms can just go right to the website. It's free. And
Oh,
just
and do you
just
know
print
the
it
name
out
of the
from there.
website, or we can link it?
You?
It's
Did-
contractingwithkids.com.
Contractingwithkids.com, and we will link that in the show notes as well. So that's really good. So why don't you take us?
It's not up and running yet. We're working with
Okay.
a web designer, but that it will.
We're shooting for the end for mid-April, end of April to have it up
Right.
and up and
Okay.
running.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So we will put it in the show notes if it works, but if not, maybe we'll just link it or put it down and revise it once it's live.
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you.
But so Bill, why don't you quickly give our listeners like one of the like something specific like you did and from the book, like
Sure.
a clear what the problem was, what the contract was, what didn't work about the contract, maybe something related to a child with autism or some developmental disability, so that our listeners could kind of put it together.
The morning contract and then the homeschool.
Okay. Let's talk about in the story is called By Myself in the book. And
Okay, is that on?
This is on page 77.
Okay.
And a single parent, Erico, and her 10-year-old son, Connor, with autism.
Okay.
And here's how we introduce the story. Each of these stories has a little kind of a teaser or a trailer. It says, Connor, a fourth grader with autism, is in the same class as Jeff Perry and Martina. All these stories are tied together. The families and kids know one another. Connor has trouble getting ready for school, which makes mornings hectic and stressful for him and his mom. Will a contract help get their days off to a better start? And the opening illustration shows Erica and Connor, the mom and so, and sitting next to her is Krista. We introduce in this chapter a behavior analyst. We don't go into any technical detail about what that entails. We say Krista, a behavior analyst who helps kids with their behavior, was visiting Connor and say, how are things going? And then the mom says, going pretty well, but mornings are trouble. He doesn't get ready in time, and we end up we're stressed and day's not off to a good start. And of course, Krista, the behavior analyst, says, well, I've had success using contracts with a lot of the families and children I work with. What do you think? And they talk about it, and they come up with, they really kind of end up with a task analysis. What would be the steps of getting ready? And they identify 4 basic steps for Connor: getting dressed, having his breakfast, cereal and milk, brushing his teeth, washing his face, and being at the door at 7:45 with his backpack on. Connor has some visual reading skills, but he's also had success using some visual activity schedules. It talks about taking little photos of him. He loves Legos. So the reward is earning these little Lego characters. And he has a Lego that he can attach by Velcro in the morning to keep, okay, I've gotten dressed. What do I do next? And so forth. And then down here, little Lego stickers. We call this a task record, a visual way to take data, really, to see both for the child and parent, how's the contract going. And that one works out pretty well. At the end of each story, we have what we call let's talk questions. And it's just 3 or 4 things, kind of conversation starters to kickstart a parent might discuss with their child. And here it says, what are mornings like at your house? What were mornings like for Connor and his mom before the contract? Do you think the photos on Connor's contract helped him? How did Connor feel when he got himself ready for school, and so forth? And then if I could do just one more, our last story continues. This is a second story with Connor and his mom. And now Mom, Erica, and behavior analyst Krista are meeting with Janelle Gardner. These are fictional stories, but they're based on, our experiences and, a conglomeration of many families we've had an opportunity to learn with and from. But so so the teachers there as well. And they talk about, mom reports that Connor's kind of sad. He comes home from school often and he says, I don't have friends and I wish I had more friends. And so the three adults, they talk about how they might help him with that. And they identify having conversations with classmates, try to help him learn to initiate and hold a conversation. And so again, in behavior analysis, special ed speak, it's really a task analysis. There's no technical language whatsoever in the book, but what's identified on the contract are these 4 things. So the task is talk to another student. When do you do this? Each day at school, during lunch, recess, free time, or group activities. How well? This is a critical part of a behavior contract of helping both child and parent agree on what the task entails. Practice 3 to 5 minutes with students selected by the teacher. Start a conversation with another student. Tell Ms. Gardner, that's his teacher, how the talks went. Take Ms. Gardner's note home to mom and report to mom. So what we've got here really is a homeschool contract where, again, teacher, family, behavior analyst, all collaborating on this contract to help Connor. The ultimate goal is to make friends, but as a step towards that, to have conversations. And that story ends like
There's a happy ending.
A happy ending. And he jumps off the bus and his mom's crying. And he says, oh, Perry invited me to his birthday party. And he likes baseball just like I do. And had to get baseball in there.
Yeah. So that's great. I think that helps our listeners, and a lot of people will just be listening, but Bill is showing some examples from the book. So if you want to hop on and actually watch the podcast or fast forward it so you can see what he's showing, and that's helpful too sometimes. But I think you did a good job of explaining. So even if people are riding in their car or exercising, they'll be able to get the idea. So with all of your contracts, though, you do have the child and the adults both sign, right?
Mm-hmm. Except we do have one chapter where the young boy makes a self-contract.
Okay.
And he signs for both lines. Because he's the one who's motivated. He wants to improve a skill, which is a mathematical skill. He's a 4th grader also. And that's the only case I think we have of a self-contract. Yeah. But we're trying to show in the book that contracts are not only reserved for bad behaviors or problems. If you have a goal, a behavioral goal, some skill you want to learn, you can use contract for that as well.
Yeah. And I was thinking as I was looking at the book, because you sent me a copy, which I appreciate, that, on page 104, where you are talking about the contract to make friends and to talk, he's checking off, or somebody's checking off and Xing off. And I was thinking this really goes along with self-monitoring, which is another ABA technique that we really never discussed, but, basically, if you are at the language ability and the cognitive ability that you can actually mark off, if you want to lose weight, writing down what you ate and checking it off, and weighing and measuring your food, or weighing and measuring yourself at a certain interval, if you set your mind to it. And I'm glad you mentioned the self-contract, you could change your behavior, but it is going to rely. And if you don't write it down and you don't measure it, it's not going to improve. Mm-hmm. One other question about that, I have a couple questions, is I see this is like this contract, at least on this paper, goes for like 3 weeks. Is there, I find that if it's just a contract forever, it's not going to work. So what is the time limit, and does that depend on the behavior and the reinforcement?
It depends on the behavior and the reinforcer, just as you're saying. We don't see contracts as a permanent solution. They're not. It's a transition to get you from point A where you're struggling or you have a goal to point B where you're doing better, you're doing well. And then the idea is to phase out the contract. So it's a relatively short-term solution to a problem, but will have greater effects. It can be generalized into the future for future gains.
So there are instances where it makes sense for a contract, both parties agree it's a time-limited contract to begin with for a particular reason, to meet a goal or something's going to happen in a certain time. In one of the chapters in the second half, kind of the how to do it parts for parents, we go through in pretty good detail with another new example. That section begins with what is contracting, how might it benefit a family, what are the parts of a contract, and then the next 3 chapters are selecting tasks for contracts, choosing rewards, and writing contracts. The chapter that follows is how to get a contract off to a good start. Here's some troubleshooting ideas for when a contract doesn't work as you had hoped or planned or wished. And then that ends with how to fade out contracts. So yes, we view it in most every case, it'll be a temporary
a time
intervention.
And the other question I have is when we talked way back in the beginning of the show about if then, first you do your work, then you get this. And I just created a mini course that I'm going to talk about actually next week in the podcast. It's not quite available yet, but it's called No More Timeout. And it is positive parenting without threats, bribes, or punishment. And one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of first work or do your tokens and then you get, to escape from us and if then is because then people, like I could see this being where, I made the reminding them of the reinforcer, kind of arguing with them that, the room's not clean. So how do you avoid that slippery slope? Because we are, and I know you are both completely positive and, want to have a positive relationship, positive procedure. So how do you get not into that threatening mode with contracts?
Well, for one thing, we do have a chapter where exactly what you're talking about happens. The kids have contracts with their parents. They're doing really well. And the parents continue to say, remind them and nag them and carpet them, do this. You didn't do it. Remember to do it. Have you done it yet? All of the kinds of things that we're all thinking with our kids. And the chapter makes the point of this isn't helpful. So what the kids do is turn the tables on their parents, and they have a contract with the parents so that instead of nagging them, reminding them, they thank them. They praise them for doing their tasks. And I think that chapter will, and also some material we have at the back of the book, will communicate to parents, this is positive. Put this in place, let it go. Use praise, positive. The nagging is just going to complicate the situation and put a negative spin on the contract for you and your kids. So it's hard. I mean, we're parents, we're grandparents. It's hard to control yourself sometimes.
Tough job.
It's a tough job.
But and I think it just goes back to like kind of the whole philosophy of giving 5 to 8 positives to every negative.
Right.
We did do a podcast interview with the 3 podcast hosts from ABA, Inside Track, ABA. I think I'm getting that right. But anyway, it was on Glenn Latham's work of positive parenting and Behind the Schoolhouse Doors, 8 skills every teacher needs. So I think we should link that in the show notes too, because if that's one of your objections to getting and using this book and trying to get contracts, I think you need to be positive. And next week, I'm going to talk about no more timeout and no more threats and bribes and punishment. I think that will make sense as well. But I do see that happening a lot. So when people want to use if then, I'm like, we're not doing enough positives to do it.
not only a recurrent theme in the stories, but in our little introduction to the book, Jill and I, we try to make our best to make 2 points. One is we view contracting as a teaching strategy. As Jill said, this is not just some intervention because something your child doing or not doing bothers you. And as that strategy will be most effective, has the best chance of working if it's collaborative. So all of these stories, it's not parents have identified a problem. They sit the kid down. They say, we read a book that tells us how to make here it is, kid, sign here, like that. This is what we're not at all.
Right.
And so we really do our best in the introduction and throughout the book, and particularly in the stories, to show how as a collaborative, as a family system, you've got a really good chance of this being effective, and not just effective, but having fun with it. So another point we make at the beginning, and we close the book with, is this isn't the silver bullet for every problem and challenge that every family has. This is a solid research-based strategy that has a half a century of research behind it. It's a good bet. We really think if families put these, what we're suggesting, give it a try, at the very least, they'll learn a lot more about one another and their family relationships.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I read the whole book. It is excellent. I think it's a unique book. It's written in a different format and lots of examples. And I will be, definitely recommending the book going forward. And maybe I'll look at the contract on your own thing and see if I can implement that, because I think the more we focus on improvement of ourselves, of the situations, whatever situation we're in, the better. So we are going to have to wrap it up. It's been a pleasure to get to know you both better. Before I let you go, part of my podcast goals are not to just help the kids, but help the parents and professionals that are listening be less stressed and lead happier lives. So do each of you have self-care tips or stress reduction management tools that you use that you might be able to recommend?
Got several that I'm not sure you could put on air.
Sure, we can put anything on the air,
Yeah.
and if not, we'll cut it out.
Well, to me, I would say, you're not alone. Parents, whether you have a child with a disability, without a disability, you're going to have bumps in the road. And things aren't going to turn out the way you want them to necessarily. But you're not alone. Just keep trying. That's what we do. We have done. We're still doing it. We have adult children and little grandchildren. And we know we're not the only ones who experience problems. So to me, that's kind of comforting. Do you have any?
Well, you can make a lot of mistakes. I speak from personal experience here. You can make a lot of parenting mistakes to the point where your wife says, read your own damn book. That's chapter whatever. So it's kind of, Skinner said, there's levels of knowing, right? And but you can make a lot of mistakes, but keep your eye on the ball and just keep plugging and keep your heart in there, keep pressing the lever, keep hugging the kid, have some time for yourself. You'll be all right.
Well, I think you both are making the world a better place. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary.